As one of the directors of the Web Science Institute, it's my really great pleasure to be able to welcome today's speaker, Evelyn Ruppert, and also to have the chance to tell you a little bit about her before she begins. Evelyn is Professor of Sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London, and she has arrived there via the Centre for Research on Economic and Social Change at the University of Manchester and the Open University, and also, very interestingly, via time as a professional planner, government policy advisor and consultant working in Canada. Evelyn, very interestingly for many of us here, I think, describes herself as a data sociologist, and her work investigates how different social and technical devices organise and constitute populations of objects as objects of knowledge. She has recently completed an ESRC project which has been looking at the social lives of digital data objects, amongst which in that project she's been interested in the risks and challenges that are facing us in a time of what we call big data. She's also recently just started a new project funded by the EU, in which she's working with a number of different national statistical agencies, including the Office for National Statistics, and we're very happy to have representatives from that organisation with us today, but also national statistical agencies from Ireland, from the Netherlands, from Croatia, from Poland, from Finland, not Poland, Finland, everywhere. And what she's been doing with those national statistical agencies is working together with them to define questions about what official statistics might mean in a time of big data, how big data might be used along with, instead of, to complement or to even possibly replace. I think there's a big discussion going on here about this, the traditional forms of statistical data collection, and may actually, we had a very interesting seminar about this earlier, may actually be challenging the kinds of questions and the ways that we're collecting data in the future. It'll come as no surprise to you then, from that very, very brief history of Evelyn's recent research, that she is also the founding editor of a new journal, Big Data and Society, which is an interdisciplinary journal, and I think very unusually also seeks to draw in a range of contributions, not only from academia, but also from industry, government, and others who are also interested in questions and challenges and risks around big data. It's already been the pleasure of several of us to hear Evelyn talking about the Arithmus project earlier on this afternoon, but it is especially my pleasure to be able to tell you that I have heard Evelyn lecture in this kind of format on a number of occasions before, so I really know what a treat is in store for you today, and I also know that I should say no more and pass over to Evelyn, who is going to talk about reflections on big data in society, visualising an emerging field. Welcome, Evelyn. I should also say, of course, the hashtags are here and the handle for Big Data in Society is here, so if anybody is moved to tweet or use other forms of social media during the lecture, please go ahead and do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. I very much appreciate that introduction. I'm wondering if we could have the lights dimmed in the front a bit. I'm not sure if that's possible with the live streaming, but might be more apparent, especially some of the images and visualizations. Well, it is really a great pleasure to be here, and I especially want to thank Susan for being a fantastic host, because as you move through a day like this of meeting various people, we've had various events, it's really lovely to have someone who's guiding you and getting you to places on time, and I very much appreciate that. But also following from the seminar earlier, for also the generosity of the students and chatting with a lot of you and hearing about your ideas is one of the reasons doing these kinds of things is of interest and is very stimulating, because it really opens you up to different ways of thinking, and especially amongst a new generation of social scientists. What was also really interesting in talking today to many of you is that I think web science is not only talking interdisciplinarity, but doing some of the, what we say, walking of it and the doing of it, which means not just having people from different disciplines together, but individuals taking an interdisciplinary approach to their objects and subjects of interest, which I think is our especially big challenge in a time of big data. So it's really encouraging to see this happening. I'm not sure how clear that comes to my audience here. Maybe it's on the live streaming better. Can I on here?
Is that a problem for you? No, it's okay.
we'll have someone adjust that as I'll just continue. This is the design of what we have variously called the logo or brand of the journal that Susan introduced, called Big Data in Society, which was launched last June. It's currently on our blog site, but it's soon going to be migrated to our journal website. And it's going to become part of what we call a dynamic and interactive interface to the journal. Now, I'm going to talk about this design not simply to promote the journal, which, it may sound like an opportunity to do so, and it may well lead us in that direction, but I wanted to use it more as an opening to a discussion about some key concerns or issues related to big data. And I will use what is deceptively a simple diagram or a network illustration to sort of open up some of those questions. Because I think this well represents some of the concerns and issues that we are engaged with. Particularly, I'm going to talk a bit about how the design is a means for us to interpret what we can call the sort of changing dynamics and configuration of themes and interests that are making up the field of big data over time. This is one of our objectives of starting with something like this. But also how it builds on a particular social scientific method and approach to the analysis of large textual databases, which is called co-word analysis. Thirdly, I'm also going to talk about how it takes up and engages with some of the concerns that big data practices, which I'll define in a moment, raise in relation to things such as visualization, recursivity, performativity, interactivity, and dynamism. And finally, how it can also be understood as a critique or a reflexive critique of the network visualization itself. So those are the four things I'm going to explicate through this example. But first, I'm going to give a little bit more background to what Susan has already introduced to the journal, because that will help explain perhaps some of the further points I'll be making. First, I think it's important to note that it's an open access journal, and it's a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, and it's publishing interdisciplinary work. We have people from the arts, humanities, social sciences, computing, and we're also interested in looking at their intersections with the natural sciences. But altogether, we're interested in how we come together to ask or pose that question and respond to the question of what does this mean and why is this meaningful for societies? Secondly, it's also a digital-only journal, so it does not come in a print version. And it also involves publishing content as soon as it becomes available, which is, you could say, what most journals are moving to today with online first and versions similar to that, where content comes out as it's available and ready. But also because it's digital only, it allows for a variety of different forms of multimedia, kinds of visualization, perhaps interactivity, but also what we could say are the kinds of multimedia that now are central to a lot of big data analysis. So it's trying to create a space, too, for what is becoming perhaps new modes and ways that we not only represent, but we analyze data. Now, while the core sort of content of the data is our bog standard in academia of the peer-reviewed research article, we've also created a space for commentaries, especially from non-academic organizations and individuals. And we have some commentaries from Microsoft and Google, from national statisticians, and soon one coming out from the Bank of England. In that way, trying to engage and open up the debate and conversation about big data, especially at its moment, as we could call it, as a moment in formation. And in that way, its key purpose is to create a space for trying to connect debates, not only across disciplines, but from the academy to industry, business and government as well. Because we would argue, as a journal editorial team, that big data has implications that cut across our various domains. But there's another thing that we're trying to do with it and in opening up that space is we're trying to move beyond what we could say are really becoming popular and dominant definitions of big data. And starting to treat it as, instead of having a definition that addresses what sometimes is called the 3 V's of volume, velocity, and variety, to look at the changing or emerging field of practices that is not being defined by, but perhaps the very things that are generating novel data qualities that we now start to call high volume or high velocity or granularity. So in that way, we are calling attention, we hope, to how data, as we engage with it, is being sustained and also passing and moving around through different domains and worlds through multiple and selective social and technical practices that are not only about technologies, but norms and decisions and choices and protocols and rules, and drawing attention to those aspects. So taking that up, we say, well, instead of how big, how fast, how detailed, etc., we're trying to focus on those practices and effects. So that includes looking at the digitization of content, interactive and recursive formats as practices, or digital tracking as well as another kind of practice that's generative. So if you follow that, we argue this enlarges our definition and gets us out of trying to close down what is big data and perhaps open it up. So it can include, to us, not only what some would call the natively digital, which is stuff that's generated through the internet, but also that which involves digitized surveys and censuses or books or corporate transactional data, government administrative registers, open and crowdsourced data, digital data repositories, the curated data sets of genomic sciences, historic census records, and we could go on to how there's similar practices that cut across these different domains. But I think another thing that's important about placing attention on practices that comes out of this is that we have changing relations to data that is happening through these practices that cut across these different contexts. And it's those relations, especially as a social scientist and sociologist, as Susan introduced me, is what I'm very interested in, is how we can think about these changing relations by thinking about different data practices. So, for example, here is our website, our blog, where we can see our cover page, and one other thing that we include here are bookcasts. But what we can start thinking about when we start opening up the issue of relations, we can start thinking about especially how social relations are being done and being redone in different ways, and are kinds of practices that we need to pay attention to. If we think of the digital actions that we engage in everyday life, we know those are generative of data, but they're also inventive of new forms of being social, of new forms of interacting and connecting and transacting. So if we think of social networking sites or self-tracking apps or open data, we can think of these as both social and technical arrangements that are instantiating social relations in new ways. The social is not being done as it was done before, but being done in new ways, and as constitutive and forming of who we are as both individuals and collectives. And I think that is one of the aspects of contemporary sociality that we need to pay attention to, because it starts to blur the boundaries and distinctions, especially between what we sometimes refer to as online and offline worlds. And I think this is one of the distinctions that we want to challenge and open up. But at the same time, as we know, when we are instantiating new social relations, we're also materializing massive quantities of data about those relations. And this is giving rise to what we call new method relations. Basically, the data that is being generated is not only materially implicated in what we could call new forms of sociality, but also our methods, too, are being recomposed or being done and creating new relations between different actors that are opening up different relations between us in the academy and us with industry, or us with our so-called data subjects, as they're sometimes referred to. Basically, we have various actors in lots of different contexts inventing different ways or methods, such as social network or sentiment analysis, to assemble various technologies and to make sense of some of that data that is coming out of the various social relations and sociality that I mentioned earlier. But this is also requiring new expertise and skills and technologies as we start to what many people call repurpose that data. Because as we know, people who participate and engage in sociality online and digitally are not doing so for research purposes, they're doing it for other purposes. So when we talk about repurposing, it's taking data that is being generated as a result or as a byproduct, as some would put it, as an economic transaction or a social interaction, and repurposing it, for example, for research. And in doing so, we assemble different practices such as formatting, cleaning, linking, and mining, and correlating, visualizing, inferring, and modeling, etc., to understand those social relations. There's a third set that we could consider and think about too, and that's what I would call a set of relations or data relations that people in their everyday lives are becoming ever more aware of. And that when we talk about this subjectivity called data subjects, we know that data relations have become part of everyday lives and vocabularies, and thanks especially to exposés about national security agencies snooping and collecting data and their data practices, we know publics are more and more familiar with these very kinds of activities, and also with terms such as metadata. When I wrote about metadata years ago, you couldn't get anybody interested in that in the public, and now a lot of people are aware that it's not just my conversation, but it's, the timestamp on that and who I'm calling that may be more of interest. And that kind of metadata opens up a very different relation to data that people, I think, more broadly understand now. So we can see it as an object of public debate itself, but also an object of interest of publics themselves as they, through movements such as the quantified self movement, also engage with data and look at themselves and understand themselves through data. So we also have people working with data in a variety of ways, and sometimes also through open government data and understanding data in ways perhaps they never did before. So my point here is that we can think of data as being really active in social worlds in a variety of different ways. And they're not only remaking our social method and data relations, but we can also think about how they are recombining different forms of technical and social actors in new and unforeseen different ways. But finally, we're in a university, and so of course we have to talk about our research relations is also changing, because I think that is also another very important, or what we could say is big about big data. Our academic craft, in the first instance, we're generating a lot of that data we're talking about. A lot of the things that we do now, not only through online journals, but through blogs and websites and tweeting, if you are tweeting right now, we are also very much ourselves part of these very relations that I'm talking about as data subjects and as actors. So we're participating in it, but also in relation to this journal and this design, which I'm going to get to now, we are also involved in defining the themes, the concerns, what matters, what's important, that make up, if we want to call it this, big data, a field, and a field of research. And that also includes what we would sometimes in sociology call institutionalizing practices. And that includes all the kinds of investments that we are putting into it, and therefore bringing attention to it, whether it's economic investments or symbolic investments in the term, or the infrastructures that we are doing in terms of technologies or research funding programs, which we are getting more and more of over time, the projects we do, the university curricula that we create. We are establishing the very field and its matters of concern, at this moment. So we're very much engaged in defining what it is through those various kinds of investments. So that brings me back to the journal and this design, which I would say the journal is participating in one of these institutionalizing practices. And as I said at the beginning, rather than settling on a definition, we're taking the what is big data and what matters about big data as an object of our interdisciplinary concern and sets of debates. So when we started to think about designing a digital and online visual identity, we wanted to produce something that could capture that making and contribution to the making of a field and its interests, and also to track its changing configuration over time in terms of themes and interests that are expressed in the content of the journal, and therefore how it's part of making up this field. And this is what we came up with. So it was designed by a team led by one of the co-editors of the journal, Paolo Ciccarelli, who directs a group called Density Design at the Research Lab of the Politecnico di Milano. And other members of his team are Daniele Cimineri and Federica Bardelli. We first decided to go about this by using the journal's keywords. But when we started designing it, we didn't have keywords yet because we didn't have contributions. So we had to start somewhere. And what we did is, through Sage's assistance, we were able to get access to all of the keywords from social science journals at Sage from January 2012 to September 2013. And use those keywords to start generating designs. And when we went through it, we came up with these top keywords across all those social science journals. So these are measured by frequency across all of their journal sites. And we went through a variety of visualizations and designs to see what we might do with those keywords. And this is one which you could call kind of like a heat map, where we have the hottest terms marching to the coldest ones down at the end. And the idea would have been you could have clicked on one of these and then got to the articles that were about that keyword, and you could move through what was hot and what was not. But again, based on a frequency thing, analysis. And we did a lot of other varieties of this kind to see what we might be able to come up with in terms of a visualization. But what we settled on was this, for a variety of reasons. One is because it's most recognizable and dominant. I think arguably the network diagram of lines and nodes is what you see most frequently when you see analyses of big data. But we did it more than that. We did it for that reason. We did it also for a number of other principles, which I'm going to outline. But first I want to describe what's being enacted in this particular diagram. First, as you can see, the nodes are selected keywords, but instead of frequencies, what you see here are the strongest or most recurring relationships between keywords within individual articles, and that defining its dominance. And the bright line and the thicker line signal strongest relations between keywords across all the journal content. So keywords have to appear frequently together, not frequently on their own, to make it into the design. So it's not on a simple frequency account. So it excludes words that appear frequently but not in some form of regular association. Now, this might be a kind of depressing thing, but the strongest relationships are between depression and anxiety across all the social science journals, and also between adolescence and obesity. Well, we might be able to interpret and think about that, but we also have between race and gender. But you start to see that those in the SAGE journals become the dominant keyword association. But basically it draws on what we could call a kind of old method in the social sciences called co-word analysis. And that's an analysis that's been taken up by another co-editor on the journal, whose name is Richard Rogers, at the Digital Methods Initiative at the University of Amsterdam, and also a colleague of mine at Goldsmiths, Nurcha Mattis, who works on these kinds of mappings. Basically, what co-word analysis did when it was initially introduced back in the 1980s was to rework the traditional academic citation analysis. And we academics know a lot about that, where we look at, through a citation analysis, popularity measures, or we could say a frequency count of well-cited articles as being the ones that are top because they get most cited. But what different researchers in the 80s argued, it doesn't tell you much about the emergence of a scientific field and its concepts and interests of concern. It tells you what the top articles are, but does that tell you substantively across all content what are the objects of concern or matters of concern there? So if you think of citation analysis, you could think of those as like social networks where you focus on popularity metrics. But instead, co-word analysis, which was brought forward by a theorist named Michel Calon and others in the 1980s, sought to think about how we might identify thematic clusters and argued that this would help us to map emergent vocabularies and emergent innovations within a scientific corpus. So rather than the most cited here, we get a measure of emerging and dominant scientific concepts and emergent vocabularies through a co-word analysis, where one can also measure the rise and fall of those associations. So you can look at variations of rises and falls over time, and it's those variations and mentionings that become key to understanding the emergence of innovation and also scientific concepts. Now others have taken up that more recently to do forms of looking at online network media, such as changing word associations here in relation to an issue such as austerity, in this example of looking at tweets done by Nurcha Mattis and Esther Welterrede, basically taking up the same idea to see what are the strong co-word associations within clusters of tweets. And there are also, you may be aware of popular online platforms such as Infamous that do this in relation to words that you can select and to search in terms of news and social media online sources. And kind of like the tag clouds or word clouds that we know, the size of words here reflects their frequency. But like co-word analysis, it also shows the relations between those high-frequency words with how they're trending, in this case, with other words, or proximate words, because it's not a keyword. So these are the kind of background to the kinds of approaches that we started to think about when we then started to try to model the journal keywords. We built on those approaches, and we thought this might give us an opportunity to sort of map the liveliness and the changing vocabulary of the journal. So instead of frequencies and popularity, we thought, let's look at the emergent vocabularies of keyword selections. And then through that, demonstrate what's this journal about, not through the statement of an editor about what they think it is, but what our authors saying the key concerns are. So the design is basically based on an API that we wrote, which draws in a live way eventually from the journal's keywords, and this is a prototype which is just based on some initial contributions. But eventually it would be an interactive mechanism where users would be able to navigate and also play with the design. So right now would be on our blog, and this is just a short little video that shows you how it will eventually become a pop-out visualization, and how then one would be able to click around and basically navigate a journal in a new sort of format, unlike our current sort of, I'd call stasis, in doing a word search and then seeing what comes up. But here, navigating and moving through different nodes and seeing their coword associations and their dominance. We may very well have to get rid of big data because, of course, it's dominant. I'm amazed at how many authors use big data in a big data journal to say that's one of their objects of interest. It's reassuring, but we might have to take that keyword out. So eventually that would be the way that one would be able to go into the journal and navigate it. So here we would see a way of not only having it interactive to reveal a keyword, but one that also gets updated as new content becomes live. In the next stage of the development, though, we'll do something like Infamous has done, although it does it only for a selection of its content. But one would be able to then go into a keyword and then call up all those articles that have those keyword associations and then navigate to those articles and content. It then just becomes, I think, a very different way of understanding a journal through navigating all of it, and perhaps having that potential to navigate all of its content and see what articles actually were in those dominant associations. But it's really important, I think, also for us to stress that in doing this, we're also wanting to use it as a way to bring attention to some of the issues that arise when we work in any kind of network visualization or visualization of big data or analysis of big data, and through this deceptively simple design, be able to raise some of those questions. So there's a bunch of issues that I'm going to step back from that now to discuss a bit about and reflect on what I think the design tries to address these. And we'll really focus principally on the issue of visualization eventually. I've talked about some of it already, but I will get to visualization as a key matter of interest. The first concerns what we call the social life of big data. Certainly we can think of journal content and the keyword selections of authors as also being about their research relations with the journal, and how that is being configured not only by the sort of convention of selecting keywords, but also, of course, of the peer review, selection and acceptance processes and decisions of a journal, but also that here we are seeing also the classificatory work of an author who selects and states what they think their work could be summarized into in terms of keywords and what they deem as being important and relevant. By tracking those relations as live and lively and as happening, we also can, as I said before, see things rising and falling. And over time, we will show dynamic visualizations of the rise and fall of words and keyword associations in the journal over its life. But another is that we could think about how that visualization and that interactivity could also have what we call performative effects, that one may want to be in those top keyword associations or those high counts of keyword coword associations, and the very design of this could also feed back or have effects on what keyword selections authors make. It's not too often, I think, that authors go and search and see what other keywords all the other articles in a journal are using. In this, you could navigate and find what those popular keywords are. So in other words, we could potentially be producing what we call recursive effects that sociologists Dave Beer and Roger Burrows have documented when they write about the social life of data. That the design could bring active attention to and mobilize particular concerns and issues that could come to dominate the journal through its keyword selections. So it could shape those classificatory practices that I mentioned earlier. But with that, we want to just complicate things a step further, in that we're going to periodically sort of mess and unsettle the design, in part to reveal that it's not a straightforward just reflection or visualization, but it is very purposeful and what we'd call intervening design. For example, we'll occasionally alter the API so that instead of the strongest word associations, we'll go for the weakest ones and emphasize them and have them pop out more powerfully. Or we'll focus on particular content. What are the matters of concern and co-word associations within commentaries, within research articles? Or we also have an early career researcher forum, which are essays by people such as many of you who are present here on their doctoral work or their early career first projects. So it'd be very interesting to see how those concerns might be generationally different, perhaps, that we might be able to interrogate that. But in this way, we'll also show that what's made visible is a result of certain decisions about what is important and what matters and what we want to display. But a second issue concerns how we, or how this actually enables us to reflexively understand how, again, our very research practices are also shaping a field and what matters, and over time being able to see those changes. So as I said, we're not only generating a lot of data through our publications, but we're also setting some of the terms, defining some of the concepts, some of the issues and matters, et cetera, that are making it up. And we seek to visualize that and make that an object of interest, not only about how we're involved in it, but also that one could look at and evaluate about how the journal is perhaps focusing in particular directions. But the third thing, through the examples I gave, is that we want to open up what we call the sort of instability of visualizations, that there is a fragility to minor alterations and changes one can make, and how one can tinker with criteria and make that itself an object of discussion. In this way, we'll be doing what a lot of designers talk about, especially in my university, about designing as an act, where we are not just showing relations, but we're designing also the phenomenon of interest, and we're organizing attention in particular ways. So not only is the design being performative, but it's also informing in particular ways. And so for those reasons, we bring attention to that sort of informing work that we do as a matter of responsibility, in that we are making design choices and that one should be transparent about those choices that we make. And so therefore the data is just not speaking for itself, but we are ourselves involved in what is spoken, if you will. The fourth one is about issues of visualization, recursivity, and as it says, performativity, interactivity, and dynamism. And I'm going to focus on, as I said, visualization, because I've talked a lot about the others. But I want to mention these here, again, because this is done intentionally to address what I think are sometimes very complex concepts, but through a very simple visualization. So if we think about this comment about a reflexive critique of the network diagram, that is yet another reason why we are taking this on as our choice. As I said before, too, visualization is a key way that we not only represent phenomena, but we're also analyzing through visualization. It's an analytic as much as it is a representation. And that, I think, is another important reason to take on and think about the network diagram. It's relatively simple, it's popular, and it's familiar, but also we wanted to problematize it by saying what kind of web vision or understanding of data or valuation of what's attention-worthy, as Madsen has written, and how is it performative of a particular ontology and understanding of a phenomenon. For example, how does it provoke sensitivity to invariance and to anomalies and not the pattern and the center of a diagram? So I'm going to draw on two humanities scholars who have thought about this kind of questions and have critiqued the network diagram in particular ways that we want to open up through this. And one is Lev Manovich, who's a digital humanities and media theory scholar who's currently at the City University of New York. And he argues that network diagrams are typically doing two things. They're using what he calls graphical primitives, which is nodes and lines, and curves sometimes, and that they are also reducing specificities of each data object to only about, well, he says 1% of its characteristics. And I'm not sure where he got that number from, but it's a big reduction. We can accept that. In this way, he argues that they're following what could be described as a dominant science paradigm that involves, calculating totals and averages, and their representation then in things like histograms and scatter plots and line graphs. And he says the second thing that they do is they use the spatial variables of relative positions as a key element to reveal those patterns and relations. So it's a very spatial conception. And it privileges those over other properties, such as color and tone and strength of an association. For example, in our diagram was about brightness. So he says, while some practices veer from this, the majority of network diagrams follow this. And he calls into question, are we, repeating a particular form and a particular ontology and perhaps ignoring potentially others and variations to that? And one of his arguments, which I think is interesting when I get to my second example of a critic of them, is that he says what we are doing is privileging what's become an everyday way of seeing things, where spatial properties are becoming the defining thing, as well as sticking to what were at one time the available affordances of technologies, but we are moving beyond those, and perhaps we are ignoring the potential of other technologies to think about ways that we visualize in new forms. So he's critiquing that reduction and that privileging of spatial dimensions, but he doesn't attend to another aspect that I think we can think about and that we're attempting to do in our diagram, is how does the person experience data? And what kind of experience of data do network diagrams enact and promote and provoke from someone who is experiencing them? So this other author, I've been thinking about this, somebody, not this one person, but there are many artists that people draw on, but she is an artist. Her name is Anna Munster, and she's a multimedia artist and an art theorist at the University of New South Wales. And she recently wrote a book on anesthesia of networks. Now, it's in large part a critique of the network diagram, which she argues is blinding us to certain qualities, especially, she says, of unevenness and asymmetry. And she argues that its very pervasiveness and its sameness and its repetition is generating what she calls a visual and a conceptual slide into what she calls a network anesthesia, that a numbing of our perception that's turning us away from their unevenness and from the varying qualities of relationality of the phenomenon that we are representing and enacting. So she argues for ways of sensing the patchiness of a network, patchiness of relations, to look at its particularities and its complexities in new ways, and things such as how we close and open up relations by the various ways that we enact them through visualizations. So she's trying to undo what she calls a frozen quality, that fixity of a diagram, and its coherence and its tidiness and its flattening and its sort of repetitive way of dealing with quantities. And that in doing so, it's doing what perhaps other practices do, such as numbing and normalizing and codifying relations into something recognizable, but not opening them up to other things such as uncertainty. To accomplish this, she does a shift from what, especially in the work of the pragmatist philosopher William James would call, from what we can think of the perceptible to perception. And there's an important difference that I think is really interesting to think about, the difference between perceptible and perception. Perception or perceiving involves kind of making worlds, seeing things happen and as they go, and being part of understanding and interpreting, an interpretive kind of mode of being engaged in a visualization. In contrast, a perceptible is to see something that's already been seen and that is given back to you as already given and seen. So a pattern seen in data is an example of the perceptible. It involves generalizing things and repeating that generalizing understanding. So it's recognizable through its recurrence and its patterning. So we can comprehend it and we can experience it. But what's perceptible often comes in to stand for what is perceived. The perceived often gets lost. So she makes a second move, where she seeks to understand how can we think about not reducing perception to human experience, but to understand how a network experience or an experience of a network diagram can be a happening through which there is an ongoing relation between human and technologies that's instantiated in that network diagram. So this doesn't really do what a lot of people who work in human technology or human-computer interaction understand experience of technology. Instead, she inverts a relationship there to focus on how networks experience, where we are in the network, or what she calls anesthesia of a network. So it's an experience that's not given, but involves these kinds of recursive relations between humans and technologies that are actively forming, and which tend towards repetition and difference as well, and not simply repetition. So in admittedly really small and modest ways, we've been trying to think about some of Manovich's and Munster's challenges. And we also have drawn on their work because they're also on our advisory board. So you can see we are a group that is drawing on each other's interests, experience, skills, and knowledge to be thinking about the journal. So while keeping with the recognizable and perceptible elements, such as the nodes and lines, we are doing this as an experiment that can perhaps challenge the numbing and frozen effects of network diagrams and make them more mutable and mobile. To also introduce novel ways for thinking about a journal and its effects on an emerging field, which I pointed out, but also to resist the flattening through enabling the navigation to go to the detailed record, to move from the more generalized pattern to the specific entry to which it's related, but also to vary those co-word associations that are given visual prominence, and thus to bring attention to design effects and to keep that as an ongoing and active and changeable thing. Also, as you saw through the little video, is to enable users then to also interact, intervene, and mess with it, and thus destabilize what it enacts so it doesn't become a fixed and frozen quality. We're also attempting to be transparent by accounting for those design acts or decisions that we make when we alter the API and reorganize or disorganize the design. We'll, for example, write regular blogs on that activity and invite commentaries and critiques back to it. But then the last point is that we want to bring attention to how that design is a collective accomplishment through all those things. Not only the API and design criteria, but also keyword choices, to the strategies of authors, to the navigational work of readers, because we will also follow that kind of click and play data and see what users are doing and how they are navigating and what differences we can see about that navigational sort of paths that they follow over time. So we could say, on the one hand, this is just a simple diagram, but through all these different ways, we think through its simplicity, we can start to engage in these kinds of questions, which I think one could take up in relation to lots of different projects and practices involved, especially in visualization, and that way perhaps critically open up new ways of thinking and talking and then also doing data analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank Evelyn very much. I think that was a really clever presentation because on the one hand, Evelyn's been taking us through the issues, the intentions and the choices of the editorial board and what you wanted to do with this journal. But by grounding it in that, I think you've enabled us to see some of the really fundamental epistemological and methodological, ontological challenges that are facing all of us who are interested in big data. And particularly many of the issues that we grapple with in web science around the intractably socio-technical nature of these big data. So I think your talk operated on these different levels and was fantastic. Thank you very, very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
We have some minutes for comments, questions to Evelyn. Would anybody like to begin that process? I know it's late, it's a bit dark in here. Maybe I'll put the lights
up again. Yeah.
Leaf.
Thank you very much. That was a really, I think it would be incredibly compelling argument for why these complex multidimensional networks are in some ways so poorly served by our traditions of two-dimensional. All as you work with networks, every time you do a PowerPoint or you try to print something in text, you're forced to then do all of those things that you just talked about of reducing this to this kind of planar form that doesn't allow you to do all the great stuff. So I suppose two questions. I mean, one, is this one of the reasons that the journal is intentionally digital only, because it gives you these options to you're not forced to do that? And secondly, do you think that there are, by virtue of having an online only journal, there are lots more kind of multi-dimensional, or there's much more potential for people to express ideas in ways that maybe networks, but there are a variety of other things that you can do that you simply cannot do simply in these kind of two-dimensional media that we're used to.
Yeah, to take the second part first, we do have some examples now of sort of complex visualizations that really just would not go into print. And some of them are dynamic, and especially uses of color and being able to pop it out, that really matters to understanding it. And I think that's a key thing. And I think we are going ever more in that direction and needing, space to be able to do that and not try to reduce it to, to paper. I mean, one could, of course, print still, but you would lose, that without having the online experience. And the other part was the reason for going digital was to enable, that to happen. Not only that enable us to navigate a journal in this manner, but to enable those kinds of complex visualizations to happen. We just felt that it matched completely to its object, to operate it this way, including this design. So, yeah.
Just wondered if you had any intention of collecting the paradata of people interacting with your journal.
Yeah, I didn't use the word, Pete, at the end, but that's what I meant by following clicks and getting a sense of how people navigate and use. And I mean, right now we do have versions of that. We've got alt metrics. We know number of downloads, page views. And search queries, and this is already within the journals that they look at these things to understand what people are doing. And in academia, whether you agree with this or not, we're going ever more to these kinds of alt metrics to understand that it's not just citations but also visits, etc. But for us, it's a matter of just understanding how people do experience it and move and navigate and do things with it. And to what extent it actually does become a navigational device.
You open up some incredible possibilities. I was very interested by your attempts to see the journal in a dynamic light, and to analyse and present and visualise what people are talking about, what the concerns of the community are in the moment. But the irony of that is each of the papers, each of the articles in them is a snapshot of someone's thinking and an analysis, or perhaps on a data stream, on a flow of data, and practice and capturing that practice and describing it at a moment. And it just makes me wonder, do you see a role, do you see a challenge to the way that we describe, that we analyse and describe analysis and actually explain and communicate our research, that would allow you to, rather than be, sort of say, oh, it worked for this bit of data that we looked at, and that was 2 years ago and counting, but it constantly refreshes itself for what is it in, sort of in the moment.
Wow, that's a sort of complex question. It'll be interesting what we think about that in a couple years' time. Because this is in development, we're going to be adding different features and also not, stabilizing it itself. Not just that we'll be reversing the prominence issue, but adding different features as we also go along. But if I followed your question correctly, Les, one aspect that I think is important to this is, I mentioned earlier that this is an open access journal. And our sense is also that I don't know how many people outside the academy will read anything I've ever written or even know how to find it or to look at it. One of the things we think this could open out also up for the academy is for different publics to have at least a way into seeing what are the main concerns being debated about this in an academic journal, who may never want to read actually an article but may want to get a sense of it in a manner that's not going to be as it is right now, it's kind of, I still hate doing searches on the current, interfaces we have to search for an article or something. It's absolutely so centuries ago in my view. We really need something more up to date, but not just for ourselves, but if we are being more accessible and want to be more accessible, we also have to find ways of mobilizing that access. I think that's inventive. So I don't think that entirely gets to everything you've said, but I think some of the issues you've raised are things that we want to reflect upon as we also think about this journal as, and I think the Academy needs to do this better, is thinking of it as a space as opposed to an academic journal with a bunch of articles on it. And we've conceived of it as a space by opening up these different kinds of sections, but also trying to open it up as an interface that enables other voices to come in. So I think it's great we have in this country open access as a policy, but we have to take that beyond just putting our articles on a repository in my university, and if you want to try to find them, good luck, but it's not very easy. But I'm open access. I think we've got the technologies and capacities, and I think we need to be more creative in how we do open access. So there's also that kind of, if I can call it an agenda that's attached to it as well.
I have a question here and then a question here.
Thank you very much for the talk. Very inspiring. Actually, a lot of the keywords are sort of sparking other keywords, which are the part of the diagram, visualization, design that you have intended today. But I have a question about the peer review process. And with all the innovation and the opening up of the voices to other people, how much of an innovation are you planning to introduce in your peer review process?
There's the door.
Yeah. Well, peer review is, I can talk for it and against it on both of it. I still think it's the best thing we have in terms of, quality of academic publications. And the peer review process, when it works well, it works well. When it doesn't, it can fail miserably. So when we talk about peer review, we talk about double blind. But when we talk about that as double blind, we're a small, very tight community, and blindness is often very hard to maintain. But in any event, even if we are able to do that, I think we have to be really stringent in how we operate that peer review process to ensure academic quality, but not to the exclusion of new arguments and new debates. And why I'm stating that is that in being an interdisciplinary journal, one of the difficulties we have is, sometimes we have articles that don't take any interdisciplinary approach and are, very, perhaps a narrow technical, let me call it a very technical approach that doesn't, engage with any kinds of issues about what this means for societies. I'll just use that little caption. And on that, we are engaging in a very good screening process of saying, is this something that belongs in this journal, which is trying to open up questions and not, make them too narrow. So that is a really tough decision. So it's only through a very long process of circulating amongst ourselves that we manage that. Where we try to open it up further, though, is through the other sections where we don't have the peer review process. We just have an editorial review. So whether it's commentaries or our early career essays, we leave that as a more open space and hope to have other voices that may not, go through the lengthy research article route to come in. But it's a really tough question. I would still like to have someone propose something better than peer review, especially if it is a good, well-run and professional process. I haven't been able to come up with one yet.
Yeah.
Fascinating talk. It's a long time since I was a student, so I'm going to ask something that goes sort of outside of that area. So I'm struck between the notion of how you develop expertise if your experiences are different every time you move into this different visualization, and what implications that has for how people who have to make decisions, so let's say government policy and decision makers, will go and do their research in the future with data sets that they may never see the same way twice, and how do they get good at doing that? It seems to have changed the game forward.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how that's going to work?
Yeah, I wouldn't transpose this specific example to all these kinds of other contexts that you're mentioning. But I think what can happen, and what we're seeing, I think, more of, is greater transparency about how that data is generated. Sometimes we call it provenance, sometimes it's the metadata, the data about the data, that recognizing that data doesn't just happen, that there are decisions behind it. And whether you're a government agency or you're an industry or you're a researcher, we know that those are decisions that we should be accountable and responsible to. And to say it could have been done differently. But these are the choices, and sometimes those are political, sometimes normative, sometimes practical. And I think that kind of transparency is something to be carried over. Because things do change still, and sometimes that's really problematic. One has to explain that change, and some statisticians will get very upset when trying to do longitudinal analyses, and you can't start changing the question. We're going to have real problems in making this comparable over time. So I think we have to think about a balance also between continuity and change too. Even in this diagram, there are continuous and ongoing factors. I mean, we don't destroy it and put something completely new out either. So it's matters of degree, I think. So there's recognizable but difference, recognizable and difference happening simultaneously. You're welcome.
Yes, Wendy.
We've had a lot of interesting examples here of things we can do with keyword searching. Do you feel as though looking forward into the future we can get beyond the words and have a look at innovations in image searching and into sort of spatial environment?
Yeah, I think so. And I especially am thinking about that in relation to the earlier question I think that Lev had asked, because we are trying to get more visual work happening, and we don't put a limit on the visualizations. You use the number that you need. Sometimes, and you publish in print format, you've only got 5, and you can't use all these other things. You use as many as you need. And we have one that has an article recently we published that has a whole bunch of them. And they're colorful, etc. It would be interesting about how one could then analyze those. I haven't got an answer to it, but I think it's one of the challenges of the social sciences, humanities, and others is how do we process image? I talked with a couple students earlier about that here, that we are starting to think about it. Even when we use something like, or think about social media, I mean, tweets, a lot of tweets now are images, and they're not, text. How do we analyze that, or Flickr, or other, image sources? So I don't have an answer other than I know it's a big issue and question. We need more work on that. And as a journal, too, we haven't got an answer, but that's something we've been starting to think about.
One of the interesting things, if I may, is the work that Farida Viz is doing at Sheffield and VisLab, which is exactly intended to start thinking about how we can analyse visual data on social media.
Yes.
But that's right at the beginning, and there's huge challenges for them.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, somebody on my editorial board too.
I know that. One last question. Yes.
Hi, that was a very interesting talk. I'm just wondering how you're seeking to address some of the problems that you've raised within this by liaising with people, for instance, working in the commercial sectors, so like Google or people who work with endographs who are already solving some of these issues. Is there much collaboration between the fields of academia and more of the commercial sectors? Are you seeing that happen more now, or is that something that we're still working towards?
Well, we're doing more of it, and we need to work more towards that. And I know my colleagues in Amsterdam and in Milan have been and do work with people in the private sector. I don't personally, but I think a lot of their work, engages, and they do some commissioned work in the private sector. So that is happening. And I think actually this is a really opportune object of interest and study, because unlike other things that we have developed and researched in the academy, haven't required, if I can put it that way, those kinds of partnerships. But I think because of the kinds of relations that I outlined earlier, especially about method relations, where the methods that we use now rely ever more on not only just the technologies, which we've always relied on, but also the data being generated by them that are also within the private sector. And so to do things meaningfully, we need to work in partnership ever more and engage with industry partners to talk and work on those very questions. So I think that's an opportunity, but it's I don't think we've done a very good job to date. When I say we, it's the big we, not necessarily the company here, because I know there are lots of initiatives that you have with industry partners and have had for a long time here. I'm talking more broadly
Academia.
speaking, that I think that is really a big question.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. It looks very, very dark outside.
Yes, indeed. But it's not raining.
It's not raining, I can assure you. So I would like to thank all of you for coming to hear this wonderful lecture on a very dark Thursday night. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I would like you just to join me once again in thanking Evelyn for her lecture.
Thank you.